Right now, Syrskyi has urgently announced an army of 700,000 people. Putin is planning something terrible. Russia is preparing a summer blitzkrieg. This has never happened before. Ukraine's hellish strike of retribution. This will turn the front upside down. A massive boost to the Ukrainian air defense forces. NATO and Ukraine are testing a secret weapon. Putin is urgently flying to Lukashenko. Will he deliver a message from Trump? All this and more in our program Hotspot. Shock! Russia has assembled a colossal army of almost 700,000 people. Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi has revealed secret plans, but the Ukrainian armed forces are preparing a strike of revenge. This has never happened before, a powerful counterattack. This will radically change the front. All the details coming up.
Russia has deployed nearly 700,000 troops to Ukraine. The Ukrainian army is changing its structure, and the armed forces of Ukraine will no longer remain in deep defense. Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrskyi spoke with journalists the day before and made several high-profile statements at once. The fact that the Russian Federation is preparing for a protracted war has now been stated not just in theory, but in numbers. So last year, according to calculations by our general staff, the occupying army recruited about 440,000 soldiers, and today it numbers approximately 695,000 people. At the same time, Syrskyi notes that Russia is also building up its reserves. That's 13 divisions, a certain number of regiments and brigades, another 121,000 troops. In other words, they are preparing for a long war, a war of attrition. This is their main strategy. They want to overwhelm us with their manpower, to wear us down with sheer numbers. The army is indeed large, but considering the kind of war the Russian army is waging now, it is of course, not large enough. If you raise the question of whether an army of this size as it is now is enough for Putin to defeat Ukraine, no, it is not enough. At the same time, the Russians have completely different objectives, according to the commander-in-chief. This summer, the occupiers will mainly try to reach the administrative borders of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, as well as create a so-called buffer zone in the Sumy region. Despite such reinforcements among the Russians, the Ukrainian armed forces will not simply sit in the trenches and defend themselves. Syrskyi announced that our troops will be moving out of a purely defensive posture. However, the directions, of course, are not being disclosed. As for our plans and intentions, of course, we will not remain in a purely defensive posture, because that brings nothing and ultimately leads to us retreating anyway, losing people and territory. That is why we are combining defensive actions with active defense and active offensive operations. That is, wherever possible, we strike at the enemy, carry out counterattacks, and advance where we see weak points in the enemy's defenses. At the same time, the first such weak spots have appeared in the Sumy region. According to the Deep State resource, our troops launched an offensive there the day before and recaptured the village of Andrivka. Syrskyi also reminded that the Ukrainian armed forces still control part of the Kursk region, which continues to tie down Russian units and prevents them from advancing freely in the Sumy direction. The Ukrainian army controls about 90 square kilometers of territory in the Glashkovsky district of Russia's Kursk region. These are our preemptive actions in response to a possible enemy offensive. The commander-in-chief also spoke about the reorganization within the Ukrainian army. Thus, Army Corps have been preferred over the traditional operational commands, and this process is being actively implemented. According to Syrskyi, these changes will help save personnel, meaning our servicemen who are directly carrying out combat missions will be used more efficiently. In addition, it will allow for the creation of more capable reserves, so that we have the ability to conduct active counteroffensive and offensive operations. The first wave of Army Corps Command, along with their support units, has already completed combat coordination and taken over their areas of responsibility and designated sets of troops. Next, the following wave will do the same, and in this way, all corps will take up their respective areas. In this way, we will complete the transition to a corps-based system and the corresponding restructuring of our defense. According to military analysts' forecasts, such a reorganization will already this year provide new opportunities for the effective deployment of units, repelling the Russian offensive, strengthening control over brigades, reducing our losses, and increasing enemy losses.
Sure, a true revolution in weaponry, an incredible development by NATO and Ukraine. This will save us from Russian KABs. Kyiv under attack. Russia has planned hell with Iskanders and North Korean missiles. Shocking details have surfaced. Russia is preparing for a summer blitzkrieg. The three main directions of attack have been leaked. All the details coming up next.
While Iran is shelling US military bases, Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities are once again under a brutal attack from missiles and shaheds. Ukrainians hid their families and belongings from the strikes wherever they could find shelter. These drivers sheltered their vehicles under a bridge in the capital. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky reported that 5 ordinary apartment buildings were destroyed in Kyiv alone. Last night, the apartment of well-known Ukrainian musician Taras Topolia was damaged. A Russian ballistic missile struck the home of documentary filmmaker Marina Tekachuk. Only the front door survived. The woman's car was also destroyed. As of the morning of June 23rd, the occupiers had killed 6 people. In the Kyiv region, 1 person was killed in Bila Tserkva as a result of Russian shelling. The Russians attacked the capital and other regions with Russian-Iranian shaheds and missiles from North Korea. As a result of the Russian shelling, there were direct hits at 6 locations, as well as debris falling in 25 locations in Kyiv and the region. In total, 352 drones were used in the attack, including 159 shaheds. The occupiers also launched 16 missiles overnight.
First and foremost, this is really the Russians' desire in their terrorist strategy to force the population of Ukraine to accept or to come to accept the terms on which Russia would like to end this war, that is, terms of capitulation. Accordingly, such strikes have been intensified. One of the main features of what happened in Kyiv during the latest attack, as I understand it, this is already the third such massive raid combined, using a large number of kamikaze drones, decoy drones, and cruise missiles, including ballistic one Azon, the third raid on the capital.
At the front, the enemy continues to pursue its operational objectives. Moreover, the Russians are forming reserve troops, which, according to experts, could be used in the future against NATO countries.
Of course, Ukraine is definitely keeping in mind that Russia can and most likely is planning certain military actions against NATO countries, primarily against European states. I think such plans are realistic. It is here on the battlefield in Ukraine that the future fate of Europe is being decided. That is obvious.
However, there is also good news for Ukrainians and Europeans. Ukraine, together with NATO, is testing a countermeasure against Russian KABs. It is planned that the equipment will be deployed for use already this year.
The fact that the issue of countering Russian Cubs is one of the top priorities on the agenda today is undeniable. The fact that there are technical efforts underway today to solve this problem, I hope we will see the results. However, it should be the Russians who are the first to speak about this, as they will have one of their main sources of pressure on our front and our troops neutralized.
On the night of June 23rd, Ukrainian forces launched 14 drones at the Rostov region. The drones struck the Atlas Rozreserv plant near Kamensk-Shakhtinsky, according to the Telegram channel Crimean Wind, which cited satellite images from the NASA firm service. As a result of the attack, none of the plant's workers were injured.
The strike targets equipment that, for example, cannot be replaced due to sanctions. If we talk about our strategy, it's clear that today the strikes are being carried out on unique facilities, of which there are not just a few in Russia, but in some cases there is only one such production site of its kind.
And Russia's ally Iran also cannot seem to calm down. They have promised to take revenge on the United States for the strikes on their nuclear facilities and stated that even if the nuclear sites are destroyed, the game is not over. This was stated by the advisor to the Supreme Leader of the Islamic Republic, Ali Shamkhani, who also announced surprises for Iran's adversaries. Soon, media reports emerged that Iran had attacked a US military base in northeastern Syria and that Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei had asked Putin for help.
Incredible! Ukraine is building a sky shield, a powerful reinforcement of its air defense. And at the same time, a devastating blow was dealt to the Russians. The occupiers have lost their eyes and ears. Unique enemy equipment has been destroyed. And Poland is preparing for war. This is no joke. The country is already developing a secret evacuation plan. We will show the truth. about what is happening on the front line. Details, figures, and footage right now.
Bulletproof, agile, and versatile, the Ukrainian army has received a new ground robot, the Dodger. The arsenal of Ukraine's defense forces has been reinforced with a new technological ally, the unmanned ground robotic system Dodger. The Ministry of Defense of Ukraine has officially codified and approved the new device for use. And this development by Ukrainian engineers is already ready to serve on the front lines. The system was created taking into account the real combat experience of Ukrainian units. The name Dodger, which means trickster in English, was chosen for a reason. This robot is mobile, maneuverable, has a low profile, and is almost invisible in the field. Despite its modest size, it can carry up to 250 kilograms of useful load, including ammunition, equipment, or wounded soldiers. Dodger is a multifunctional platform capable of performing a wide range of tasks. For example, it can evacuate wounded soldiers under fire, deliver ammunition and supplies to hard-to-reach positions, or deploy rapid minefields. It is also capable of participating in the tactical logistics of frontline units. One of the main features of the system, along with its agility, is the armored protection of its body. It is resistant to bullets and shrapnel, which allows it to operate in combat zones with increased risk. Thanks to this, the Dodger can function even when conventional vehicles are forced to retreat. At a time when combat operations increasingly depend on speed, flexibility, and autonomy, such solutions become indispensable. Ukrainian ground drones, like FPV aviation, are shaping a new reality in modern warfare, where technology fights side by side with humans. A strike on the Murom and the Syrskyi electronic warfare equipment. In the Lyman direction, Ukrainian pilots from the Sigma battalion of the 53rd Separate Mechanized Brigade, named after Prince Volodymyr Monomakh, delivered a powerful strike against the enemy's critically important equipment. As a result of precise actions, several targets were destroyed at once, including the Murom video surveillance complex and the Syrskyi electronic warfare system. The unit reported that Russian forces are actively moving equipment to the Lyman direction, trying to prepare a new wave of assaults. However, Ukrainian drones keep the enemy under constant pressure, not allowing them to maneuver freely. Every appearance of equipment within sight becomes a potential target. And that target doesn't last long. During the latest operations, the battalion's pilots destroyed a Ural truck and an armored personnel carrier, a shelter with vehicles and a passenger car. The Murom visual surveillance system, which served as the enemy's eyes on the battlefield, and Syrskyi electronic warfare equipment capable of jamming drones and radio communications. The battalion emphasized that even such a sophisticated electronic warfare system as the Syrskyi is unable to counter a drone when it operates with precision and determination. Ukrainian UAV operators continue to systematically deprive the enemy of critical surveillance and communication tools, disrupting logistics and limiting their ability to coordinate assault operations. In the Lyman direction, the systematic blinding and deafening of the occupying forces continues. At the same time, Poland is developing a plan to evacuate works of art in the event of a Russian invasion. Amid the growing threat from Russia, Poland has begun preparing a large-scale plan to protect its national cultural heritage. The country's Ministry of Culture reported that the project provides for the evacuation of the most valuable works of art from both state and private collections in the event of escalation or invasion. The initiative is not based on abstract scenarios, but on real experience gained in 2022 while assisting Ukraine. At that time, Polish institutions received Ukrainian exhibits, saving them from destruction and looting. Now, a similar system is being developed for domestic use, but this time aimed at protecting Polish museums. Poland's Ministry of Culture emphasized that the country's museums can no longer operate under the assumption of theoretical safety. Cultural heritage has found itself in a zone of strategic risk, and its protection is now part of the overall national defense policy, alongside strengthening the borders and plans to increase the armed forces to 500,000 personnel. The responsibility for developing the evacuation plan has been entrusted to Polish Army veteran, retired Colonel Mokars Matysiak, who heads the Department of Security and Crisis Management at the Ministry of Culture. His task is to organize logistics, identify priority sites, and establish international cooperation. Meanwhile, as Poland prepares for a hypothetical conflict, a NASAMS manufacturer's office has opened in Ukraine. Norway and Kongsberg are strengthening air defense together with Ukrainian engineers. On Sunday, the Ukrainian office of the Norwegian company Kongsberg Defense and Aerospace, one of the world's leading arms manufacturers, best known for developing the NASAMS air defense systems that are already protecting Ukrainian cities from Russian missiles, and drones began operations. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense reported that the opening of the representative office is part of a strategic partnership between Ukraine, Norway and Kongsberg. The main goal is to expand joint projects in the field of air defense, in particular to develop new solutions based on NASAM systems to strengthen the protection of the civilian population and critical infrastructure. The Defense Ministry emphasizes that the development of air defense is one of the country's key national priorities. According to the ministry, just this month Russia carried out more than 3,500 missile and UAV launches against Ukrainian territory. In this regard, special attention is being paid to scaling up production and accelerating the delivery of interception systems. The opening of Kongsberg's office in Ukraine creates new opportunities for closer engineering and manufacturing cooperation between Ukrainian and Norwegian specialists. In particular, this involves improving the effectiveness of existing air defense systems, creating new solutions for the protection of airspace and maritime areas, as well as advancing technologies in the field of interceptors areas in which Kongsberg holds leading positions worldwide. In addition to the technological and manufacturing aspects, the project is also supported financially by the Norwegian government, which once again confirms their trust in the Ukrainian defense industry and their willingness to develop a long-term strategic partnership. The Ministry of Defense expects that the first tangible results of this cooperation will become apparent in the near future. That's all for today. Tune in tomorrow for more news.
In the Pokrovsk direction, since the beginning of the day, Ukrainian soldiers have repelled the highest number of attacks by Russian occupiers. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, in this sector the enemy made 20 unsuccessful attempts to break through the defense forces' positions. Another 11 Russian attacks were repelled in the Lyman direction and 10 assaults each in the Toretsk, North Slobozhansk and Kursk sectors of the front. As the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Syrskyi, stated at a meeting with journalists, the active operations of Ukraine's defense forces in the Kursk region have significantly changed the balance of power on the front. The operation by the Ukrainian armed forces disrupted the transfer of Russian Federation forces to the east. At one point, our Kursk operation drew away almost 63,000 Russian soldiers, and together with the North Koreans, about 70,000 in total. This allowed us to reduce the enemy's pressure on the main directions and gave us the opportunity to regroup our troops. And the capture of Pokrovsk by the enemy, which had been announced since September 2024, still has not happened, in part thanks to our Kursk operation. Syrskyi, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Ukrainian forces struck a Russian special train near the temporarily occupied Tokmak in the Zaporizhzhia region. The operation was carried out by the Southern Defense Forces together with the Security Service of Ukraine and other units of the armed forces. The fuel tanks that the Russian army was supposed to use at the front were destroyed. Military experts highly praise the results of this operation and know that the armed forces of Ukraine also have the means and capabilities to destroy the railway that the occupiers built in the Zaporizhzhia direction.
We have the strength, the numbers and the means, I emphasize, to destroy this railway over hundreds of kilometers. This includes all types of ATAK-MS, so to speak, self-propelled artillery, HIMARS, our Eurogun and Smerch rocket systems, and so on, long-range artillery, and now also the special operations of the GUR. In other words, there are dozens of options to choose from to ensure this railway is destroyed for good. So one such operation is great, but there should be many more like it, so that nothing moves or stirs there at all. JTS, Jesus. Jesus, I trust.
One of the most important tasks for heavy UAV operators is to mine the enemy's logistics routes in order to disrupt their assault plans. The soldiers say that heavy drones are almost invisible at night, so the missions are carried out precisely. It flies in, drops a mine and flies away.
Because of even the slightest movement, if the mine is lying like this and it's easy to shift, it will already detonate.
Drones like the Vampire are used against everything, concentrations of enemy troops, their shelters and their equipment. The soldiers say that when command gives an order, it has to be carried out quickly and precisely, because the main thing is to cover the Ukrainian infantry.
We target tanks, we target artillery. You could say we squeeze everything we can out of the Vampire. That moment when you press the button, the bomb flies and, well, that's a real thrill. With every flight we make, the work just keeps increasing. Now we've already completed our mission. The drone is returning home. Today, you could say, was a productive day. All the assigned targets were hit. So everything's good.
Such. Level of effectiveness was demonstrated by the artillerymen. Ukrainian Marines note that even with a minimum of shells, they inflict maximum losses on the enemy. This time they hit the enemy's dugout.
Well, we've finished our task, ran into cover, now we'll wait a bit and can keep working if we get the order.
Just as steadfastly, Ukrainian soldiers are holding their positions in other directions as well. And military experts note that the Russian occupation army has also failed to enter the Dnipropetrovsk region.
There was especially a lot of talk about an offensive towards the Dnipro. First of all, carrying out such operations with a narrow wedge and a narrow strike is very difficult and very dangerous. We cut them off somewhere from the flanks and then they're gone. That's why, at this moment, they haven't managed to enter the region and claim that Dnipro is now theirs as well. I think we have a good chance to simply render this wedge worthless.
American military units in connection with a potential ground operation in Iran.
But Tehran, judging by the leaks, was expecting more. According to Reuters, Iran's supreme leader sent envoys to Moscow with a specific goal not just to secure condemnation from Putin, but real support. So far, without success, in Tehran, according to sources, they are not impressed with the level of assistance. But amid these loud statements, other voices are also being heard. The head of European diplomacy, Kaja Kallas, called for immediate negotiations to prevent further escalation. President of the European Council, Antonio Costa, emphasized that only diplomacy can ensure peace and stability in the region. And the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer reminded everyone that Iran's nuclear program remains a real threat and the US has taken measures to address it. Against the backdrop of these diverse statements, one thing is clear. The Middle East is teetering on the brink of a new phase of conflict. Right now, every diplomatic gesture is worth its weight in gold, especially when those who are used to acting with disregard for international law are now voicing accusations.
That's all for today. Thank you for being with us. We read your comments and we feel your support. Strength to Ukraine's defenders. Glory to Ukraine. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and see you next time.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
Putin made a cynical statement. Sumy is under threat of capture. Shock! The Russian dictator suddenly spoke out about the Kremlin's plans. The Russian army continues to exert intense pressure in the Sumy and Pokrovsk directions, but the Ukrainian armed forces are accomplishing what seems almost impossible. What is happening on the front lines at this very moment, and what does it mean for Ukraine? We will tell the whole truth. Watch.
They are storming more actively, more frequently, but they are not achieving the desired result. Russia has sharply increased the number of assaults on the front, according to analysts from Deep State. In particular, in June, the average number of attempts to break through our defenses even surpassed last month's figures. For more than a week now, the hottest spot on the front has remained Pokrovsk. A third of all occupier attacks along the front line are concentrated on this section. Experts say that here the enemy has decided to split up and advance in two directions at once, military and political.
As for the actions from Pokrovsk to the northeast, with the enemy advancing toward the road between Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka, here we must also talk about a separate area of combat operations around Kostiantynivka, which is one of the most important hubs for the Ukrainian defense forces.
The other group is tasked with providing a PR campaign for Putin's soldiers. It was decided to advance toward the Dnipropetrovsk region, measuring the distance to its administrative border almost daily, practically with a ruler. Meanwhile, on Russian TV, the information is presented as if a new region will soon be under Russian control, and that Dnipro itself, of course, is bound to fall.
The organization of combat operations is essentially along two directions, from Pokrovsk to the southwest. That's where the enemy has concentrated toward Dnipropetrovsk. And here we should remember that this has more of a military political significance than a purely military one. In other words, Ukraine, the aggressor, wants to move into new regions.
Kharkiv also continues to trouble the Russians. Here, the military leadership is also noting an increase in enemy activity. However, the situation remains unchanged. While holding the northern outskirts of Vovchansk, the occupiers repeatedly lose hundreds of soldiers against the Ukrainian defensive line, yet after many months, they have not advanced even a single meter. There is especially intense activity again and again, a flurry.
The enemy is traditionally especially active near Vovchansk and the surrounding settlements. There, enemy assault operations are taking place almost daily. The Russians are attacking mainly with small infantry groups of 3 to 5 people under the cover of drones. Vovchansk itself, as a city suitable for living, has long since ceased to exist. The city is completely destroyed. There isn't a single intact building left, yet the Russians continue their assault operations there as well. They keep conducting assault operations.
Another hotspot in the Kharkiv region is the Kupiansk direction. Here, Russia has tried to encircle our entire group in a semi-encirclement, but they have been unable to accomplish this task for over a year now. At the same time, battles of varying intensity take place here every day, and the recent increase in assaults has only led to greater losses among the occupiers.
In order to create a threat to Kupiansk from the north, the Russians specifically need to build pontoon crossings over the Syrskyi River along the right bank, meaning they need to establish their own logistics there. Just recently, there was another attempt to set up such crossings, but as in previous cases, it ended in failure. Our reconnaissance detected the approach of this equipment, and their special vehicles were destroyed. The bridging equipment was destroyed.
Another place where the Russians' offensive has ended in disgrace in recent weeks is the Sumy region. After capturing small sections of so-called gray zones, the advance of the Russian army there has essentially come to a halt. There is no longer any talk of taking control of the regional center itself. The most the occupiers are aiming for now is simply more deadly terror against the local population.
If we're talking about events in the Sumy region, Kharkiv region, and in the south, there's certainly a lot of media coverage. From a military standpoint, it's clear that in the Sumy region, on one of the two Slobodansky directions, the enemy is trying to carry out the Führer's order to create a so-called buffer zone in the territory of Sumy region, attempting to reach positions that would allow them to exert greater fire pressure on the regional center itself. And it's obvious that the deadlines set for the Russians by their commanders are not being met today.
Speaking of the deadlines set in the Kremlin, it's important to understand that they have been completely missed, and this is true across all fronts. The occupation of the entire Donetsk region has not happened. Key settlements like Pokrovsk, Kostiantynivka, and Kupiansk are putting up a heroic fight. Experts say that this year the Russians have not accomplished a single objective set by Moscow.
As of today, if you look back and recall the Russians' plans, nothing has worked out for them. It hasn't worked out because, firstly, the defense forces are using various methods, including systematic counterattacks, which we are seeing today, for example, in the northern Slobozhensky direction, in the southern Slobozhansky direction, as is clearly evident now, and of course in Pokrovsk as well. You recall perfectly well how, before New Year's, the Russians were already threatening to put up a Christmas tree right in Pokrovsk itself and celebrate the occupation of that settlement.
At the same time, while defending, the Ukrainian armed forces often launch assaults themselves and wipe out entire groups of occupiers. For example, most recently, the day before, the defense forces struck a Russian assault column that was moving along the highway toward Kostiantynivka. As a result, 15 armored vehicles were destroyed and the column itself was broken up before it could even approach our defensive line.
No one expected this. Putin is urgently flying to see Lukashenko. And this comes right after Trump's special envoy, Keith Kellogg, visited Minsk. Could it be that Lukashenko is going to pass on a secret message from the US to Putin? What did Kellogg and Lukashenko really talk about at their meeting? These details will surprise you. Watch this.
Alexander Lukashenko is beaming with happiness.
What distinguished guests we have.
For the first time in the past 5 years, the Belarusian president met with officials from the White House. And not just anyone, but in fact Trump's own envoy on Ukraine and Russia, Keith Kellogg.
Of all the theories about what he agreed on or didn't agree on, the one I liked most was that Kellogg really wanted to see for himself and report back to Trump exactly where the attack on Belarus was supposedly being prepared from 4 directions. But that's just a joke, let's set the humor aside. By the way, the analyst theories that Keith Kellogg went to negotiate with Lukashenko to make him a mediator in talks between Ukraine and Russia to achieve peace look no less ridiculous.
That's exactly the image of a mediator and peacemaker that Alexander Lukashenko is trying to create for himself. His press secretary reported that the talks with the American delegate lasted a full 6.5 hours and covered American and European sanctions against Belarus, the conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East, as well as the old man's relations with Russia and China.
His goal is to fit into the role of mediator without doing anything in the interests of Belarusian democratic society or the democratization of the country.
Lukashenko's trip. Well, honestly, it really feels like the Americans have decided to dig up all the political corpses, clean them up and use them for their own purposes. Because in reality, neither Putin nor Lukashenko is acceptable for a handshake. But this kind of arrangement suits them, both of them. I mean, people talk to them, they're invited to act as mediators. Lukashenko is already the mediator of all mediators, it seems.
However, it's not worth starting to prepare for Minsk negotiations too just yet. According to analysts, Lukashenko won't be able to secure a ceasefire in Ukraine just like that, in one fell swoop after a single meeting with the Americans. And no one is asking the Batka to do that anyway. On the contrary, experts are convinced that during the entire 6.5 hours of the announced meeting, Keith Kellogg was persuading the Belarusian dictator to do nothing, in other words, not to indulge Putin in his desire to launch a full-scale summer offensive.
Why is this meeting necessary today, at this particular moment? What is obvious on the surface is, first and foremost, the announced Belarusian-Russian exercises Zapad 2025, which are planned for September 2025 and which, according to the original plan, were supposed to involve a significant concentration of Russian Federation armed forces supported by the Belarusian armed forces near Belarus's western borders, including the border with Ukraine. This, of course, creates additional risks and threats, such as the potential repeated use of Belarusian territory for aggression against Ukraine.
Kellogg needed to clarify one thing: whether Lukashenko, in the fall, during or after the joint Zapad 2025 exercises with Russia, intends to allow Russian troops to invade from his territory into Ukraine or into NATO countries, that is, Poland or the Baltic states. And I think, judging by the warm words, the release of opposition members and so on, Kellogg heard from Lukashenko exactly what he wanted, that Lukashenko would not allow this to happen. Is this good for us? Absolutely.
Also, most likely, Trump's envoy passed a message to Putin himself through the Belarusian dictator.
On June 26-27, Vladimir Putin is planning to visit Minsk. He will be taking part in the summit of the heads of state of the Eurasian Economic Union. Accordingly, in this situation, Lukashenko may want to play the role of a certain messenger, passing information from Kellogg to Moscow.
Meanwhile, there are rumors in the media that Kellogg might have tried to send some kind of message to Chinese leader Xi Jinping through Lukashenko as well. However, analysts consider these reports to be outright disinformation. No matter how much Lukashenko would like to appear as the world's chief negotiator, ready to talk with either Putin or Prigozhin, it's highly unlikely that anyone in Beijing would actually listen to him.
Armchair analysts have floated the theory that Trump wants to send some kind of information, proposal or signal to Xi through Lukashenko. What kind of nonsense is that? Trump and Xi Jinping have plenty of channels, and if needed, intermediaries and ways to exchange signals or information without involving some random guy who has no influence whatsoever, namely Lukashenko. Right now, he's actually managing to stay afloat because of the overlap of two interests. He's of interest to Russia and he's of interest to China, so for now he's hanging on. If he allows a third player to use into the mix, the first two might be a little offended, but nevertheless it will actually be easier for him to balance on 3 ropes instead of 2.
Unlike Putin, Lukashenko, though a dictator, is much more flexible. Given the right conditions and circumstances, he's willing to go quite far. A vivid example of this is the release of a number of Belarusian political prisoners immediately after the visit of the American special envoy to Minsk.
Lukashenko released several opposition figures at once who had been serving astronomical sentences, including a journalist from Radio Liberty and one of the leading oppositionists, Tikhanovsky.
So, what did the United States promise the Belarusian dictator in return? We can only guess. Nevertheless, it seems that both Lukashenko and Kellogg were extremely satisfied with what was apparently their first official meeting in many years.
Escalation in the Kremlin. Russia is transferring nuclear weapons to Iran. Putin made an outrageous statement. The independent states that emerged after the collapse of the Russian Empire never existed. An oil shock is already near. Iran is ready to block the world's main artery. And also a shock from Belarus. It has become known what Kellogg agreed on with Lukashenko in Minsk. This will change everything. All the latest news you might have missed, coming up next.
Trump has, for the first time, allowed for the possibility of regime change in Iran.
It's not politically correct to use the term regime change, but if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why shouldn't there be a regime change?
He wrote this after the massive US strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. At the same time, the head of the Pentagon emphasized that the goal of the operation is not to overthrow the government in the Islamic Republic, but to establish peace.
It seems to me that at this point in time, Trump has really found himself in quite a difficult and challenging situation where he's starting to stall on all fronts. He realized that if he now leaves Israel one-on-one with Iran, well, even his core voters will start turning away from him. Maybe, after all, Trump has started to realize that making America great again is about this role, maybe not always a pleasant one, but the role of the world's policeman.
Without much hesitation, the head of Iran's foreign ministry urgently decided to fly to his friend Putin and hold important consultations.
I think it's simple. Uncle, give me a nuclear bomb. What else is there to discuss with Putin today?
But Iran is unlikely to receive help from its loyal partner. After all, the Russian-Iranian Strategic Partnership Agreement does not provide for military assistance.
Well, of course, there's no point in expecting military assistance. But if they do help, I understand that would be a complete violation of every possible agreement. But what hasn't Russia already violated? The most terrifying kind of help Russia could provide the world, the scariest would be components for nuclear weapons, especially now that the facilities for independent nuclear weapons production have been bombed.
For now, Russia is doing what it does best, issuing threats. Officially, through the Russian Foreign Ministry, Moscow has made it clear that it intends to oppose the US in the UN Security Council. And Medvedev announced that a number of countries are supposedly ready to provide Iran with nuclear weapons.
It's clear that Russia has the right to veto, and so, yes, Russia can veto any resolution that might be of some use to it. Well, that's obvious. I mean, once again, there's nothing new here. But that's still not as dangerous as the possible transfer of nuclear technology to Iran. Now, that is truly dangerous. And it's entirely possible to expect this from the current Russian authorities.
Meanwhile, Putin continues to actively live in his own world. At a meeting with the authors of history textbooks, he stated that the books contain a lot of Russophobia and distortions of historical facts. But that's not all. It turns out that apart from Russia itself, separate states never even existed.
That's where Lenin's idea of koenizatsiya and the creation of so-called independent states came from states that, of course, never actually existed.
Did you think the Kremlin would stop at propaganda? Absolutely not. The national media group, headed by Alina Kabayeva, has announced the formation of a laboratory that will work on creating a positive vision of the future for Russian society.
Russia is actually one of the few countries, if we are talking about it, there are very few countries that know how to work with atomic energy. There are even fewer countries that have their own search engine or their own messenger. And there are also very few countries that know how to create a vision of a dream, a vision of their own future. This is a very unique trait of Russia.
According to the developer's plan, the ideas from the laboratory will be used by film and literature directors. But let's remember, we're talking about Russia. And that means things aren't so simple here.
The main feeling that unites Russians today is hatred towards everyone. Hatred of America, hatred of Europe, hatred of Ukraine, hatred of neighbors, hatred of pretty much everything. And in general, the complete and utter lack of anything even remotely positive in the lives of modern day Russians, for many people, is truly and profoundly, deeply concerning, because both karma and this mutual hatred will inevitably lead to Russia, as it exists today, ceasing to exist.
Alexander Lukashenko has released Sergei Tikhanovsky, one of the most well-known Belarusian political prisoners. This happened shortly after the visit of American diplomat Keith Kellogg to Minsk. The release may be connected to Belarus's attempts to achieve a softening of sanctions.
I think this is a kind of gesture, and in this way, Lukashenko is showing that he's ready to engage with the West.
At the same time, after spending 5 years behind bars, Sergei stated that he would continue to fight against Lukashenko.
All for now. And for more hot news from the front, tune in to our next episode.